writer Amitabh Ghosh says we are on a runaway train and the planet is now heading towards a precipice on this runaway train. I think that is a unduly pessimistic viewpoint, because if we indeed are in a runaway train, then, and there's no return, it's a good time to relax and party. There's nothing can be done. But actually there's a lot can be done, and it's something which all of you can lead. And what is that? Is the last part of my talk. If you look through history, science and technology, knowledge and learning have always been the property of elites. This is, before the Industrial Revolution, during the Industrial Revolution, and afterwards. And while certain kinds of facilitating mechanisms, such as language, that is, if science and technology is done in the same language as that which the people speak, language can be facilitating, more people can come into science. Even in contexts where people spoke the language of science, English or German or French or Persian or Sanskrit or whatever, discovery and knowledge were the close property of an elite. What happened with the Industrial Revolutions and later is, while this remained so in large measure, two things became public property. One was what is called skilling. People learned tools of the trade in a variety of ways. Those tools are more and more complicated. Being an electrician or a carpenter or a car mechanic today is very, very different from doing any of these 50, 70 or 100 years ago. Being an aircraft mechanic is a great deal of skill. So skilling became more publicly available. And countries where that skilling was not available were economically less well off. The second aspect, which is publicly available much more now than ever before, is the extraordinary use of complicated technologies. Today, citizens of our country, of poor countries all over the world, can use the most complicated tools intuitively in a variety of ways. The cell phone is an example, but there are a lot of other examples. Teller machines, being able to board aircraft by performing specific roles, driving complicated vehicles, and so on and so forth. So extraordinary technologies are commonly used. Yet, those people who use these technologies routinely, even amongst the so-called elite, do not know what's inside and what it works, how it works. Now, this is a problem, and this was a surmountable problem about 50 or 60 years ago. In theory, you could open up your car and you could understand by looking at the car how it works. Your friend or your brother or your sister or someone could explain that to you. Today's car, when you open it up, it's very difficult for someone to explain all the details, and this is a challenge. So keep this in mind, that even the elite is becoming disenfranchised from knowledge, let alone public at large. But more recently, there's been a dramatic revolution and raised fears, which many people are debating whether these fears are valid or not. And these relate to the handling and use of big data. The argument is that the use of algorithms become more feasible, and tweaks in algorithms have allowed them to become more effective, so that data can be distilled in a manner and analyzed as never before. This has resulted in the breakaway exponential growth of companies which handle this data in a big way. Facebook is an example, but there are others which market data in many ways. And these and their owners have created an elite who, even by the bizarre standards of elite, are extraordinarily rich. So you're going back to an era where a very, very small fraction of the population own a very huge fraction of the wealth in the West, and the differences are very, very sharp. You're staying in a planet where the demands for change are huge, but the feeling of disenfranchisement by the majority is also huge, and they are staring at these huge differences in wealth. Yeah, and so this range of differences are a phenomenal challenge in terms of what solutions there are. So we now have two aspects to grapple with, that three actually. One, science has never been a property of populations at large. They've been the property of adults. Even as skilling of use of technologies grows, the understanding of technology diminishes. People have fears about technologies, but they use them all the time. And thirdly, artificial intelligence, the handling of big data, has created phenomenal asymmetries which need to be tackled. So how does one deal with them? To my mind, this can come about only when two things happen. When science goes to the people and people demand science. People have been demanding the fruits of science and the fruits of science and technology, but never in the history of humanity have people actually demanded science. They haven't demanded that there should be rational analysis of problems and decisions should be taken on evidence. They haven't demanded that critical thinking and logic should be critical parts of the core curriculum in schools and colleges. People have demanded, politicians have demanded, leaders like you have demanded that people have the fruits of science and technology, that they should be skilled to use those. They should be skilled to be mechanics or pilots or engineers or doctors or captains of ships and so on and so forth. But they don't have to understand the logic behind what is going on. And this is a fundamental problem. Today's technologies, which have resulted in sharp inequalities, also afford the route to break these inequalities. And that's what I think is the major venture which we should embark on. How can we do this? If you look at people such as you and other institutes such as the IITs, the central universities, our research institutions, in theory, they cater for about 5% of our student population. 95% of our student population go to state universities and colleges. Even this 5% is maybe an exaggerated number because of those who go to research. I would say a fifth of these actually are involved in research. So we need to have a research ethos much more widespread in our ecosystem. And that research ethos should be anchored on training people qualitatively in mathematics, statistics, computer science, music, language, and sport. Sport because a healthy body is a healthy mind. Music because if you don't learn that early, you're in trouble. Language, again, if you don't learn that early, you're in trouble. But if you know music, mathematics, language, and sport early on, you can pretty much handle any other subject under the sun. But this has to be a widespread approach as opposed to something which is reserved for the elite. These were areas which were reserved for the elite. How does one actually do that? We have extraordinary capacity in our top institutions such as this, and we have extraordinary capacities in our environment such as in Delhi. If you start from South Delhi and the Delhi University South Campus, IIT, JNU, the Department of Biotechnology Institutes, the Nuclear Institute, the Indian Statistical Institute, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Safdarjung Hospital, you have an extraordinary potential ecosystem. We are trying, in terms of success as an institution, to try and excel as an individual institution. That is a noble enterprise, is necessary but not sufficient. But getting together of these institutions makes both necessary and sufficient and allows us to excel as a confederation of institutions, but also address these critical problems in our ecosystem. So two things can be done. This group of institutions can take on ambitious problems. For example, cleaning the Barapura drain, taking on the most ambitious challenge in computer science or mathematics or cosmology or astronomy or whatever. So I'm not excluding basic science. But also have ways by which you reach out to the ecosystem so that Delhi University and all the other universities in Delhi also become your property. You become responsible not just for getting the benefits of that ecosystem by getting their students to come to you as research scholars, but also give back to that ecosystem. This task, these two tasks, three tasks, getting together as a confederation has already been embarked on. Dr. Rao and Others in other cities are doing that. It's an extraordinarily difficult task. Taking on tasks in our ecosystem is a very, very tough task. And there the School for Public Policy can also help in shaping how the action should be. But it's a very difficult task. And reaching out to the state universities, Delhi in this context, is an even more difficult task. So these three impossible tasks seem, completely crazy to start on. There are two solutions to solving this impossible problem. One is sorry, some interesting news. But two possible solutions, two routes. One is that it looks impossible because you have your day full. You are either a researcher or a teacher or a student, and there are just 24 hours in a day. But just as you've created a society for innovation, I don't know what it's called, FIT? Not FIT JE station. I was very nervous about that. Yeah. So this FIT is a structure. In a similar manner, either using that structure or a new structure, you can have structures which are dedicated for societal interactions or interactions with universities, which have support, and one can get more resources for that and get that going. So that is one route which can be taken, and that's a feasible route. But I would like to end by a quote, or rather a paraphrase, because I don't have the quote with me, it's on my computer, by what J.C. Bose said when he started the Bose Institute. Bose was an extraordinarily brilliant person. He was an accident of colonial education system, a subversive who excelled, and then he decided also to start the Bose Institute, what was later known as the Bose Institute, as a research institute. And he says that the trouble with impossible tasks are that they are impossible, they look impossible, but the moment you embark on them, you change the goalposts, you change the likelihood of success. So we must break our mental barrier into taking on these big challenges, define new metrics for excellence, just as you have the Shanghai metric or the London metric or whatever for being an excellent institute. Define what the metrics for excellence in our context are, so that we can truly excel by trying to breach those metrics rather than breach the metrics set by others, which is a never likely to happen challenge. Thank you very much.